This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Two recent high-profile cases are testing the limits of accountability for law enforcement by going after the FBI for missing crimes they could have stopped. We saw this happen most recently with survivors of Larry Nassar's abuse as they prepare to file a lawsuit against the FBI. They're doing this through the Federal Tort Claims Act, which was enacted back in 1964. It says that people who are injured or damaged by negligence of any federal employee can file a claim against them for reimbursement of that injury. Every year, thousands of current and former federal employees are named in these types of claims. Once they're filed, the government has 6 months to respond. When that happens, the government can settle, or the claimant can file a lawsuit in federal court. Attorneys say going up against the government in court for this sort of thing can be tricky, and that plaintiffs don't always see success. But let's unpack the circumstances of one case against the FBI that did. In 2020, a judge ruled the families of Parkland victims who filed federal tort claims against the FBI could take their case to federal court. And in March of this year, the DOJ said they awarded nearly $130 million to those families. Robert STEIN was an attorney on the case, and he told us more about how that settlement was reached.
Where we had some success in our case is when you can argue that there was written or unwritten guidance, protocols, procedures, etc. And where there are protocols and procedures and they deviate from them, that is an area where you're not in discretion anymore, right? Because the rule was passed. The rule is there. The rule says you must.
Let's walk through it. In September of 2017, the FBI received a tip that the shooter posted, "I'm going to become a professional school shooter" on YouTube. An FBI agent investigated the tip and didn't pursue it any further after October. In January of 2018, they received another tip that the shooter purchased several weapons and could possibly shoot up a school. No action was taken, and on February 14th of 2018, the shooter killed 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School.
The FBI could have and should have done more to investigate the information it was provided prior to the shooting. While we will never know if we could have prevented this tragedy, we clearly should have done more.
Both tips in this case came through the FBI public access line. The call center is responsible for all calls and electronic tips. In 2017, the year they first received a tip about the Parkland shooter, the call center received about 1.5 million calls and emails. We reached out to the FBI with some questions about how they conduct investigations, and they got back to us saying they didn't have a comment. The other high-profile case where we've seen the Federal Tort Act come up was in early June. Victims of former Team USA Gymnastics Dr. Larry Nassar filed tort claims against the FBI, claiming the agency allowed him to continue sexually abusing them after gymnastics officials reported him to the agency in 2015. We sat down with attorney Jane Reilly, who represents some of the Nassar survivors, and she explains why it's difficult to go up against a government agency, specifically the FBI.
Whether it's the FBI or local police department, there's this concept of qualified immunity, which essentially you can't just show that someone in the government made a negligent decision or made a decision that you wouldn't necessarily have made if you were in their shoes. It's a higher standard than that. And so you have to establish wrongful conduct at a higher level than you would if you weren't suing a government entity.
Here's how the case unfolded. USA Gymnastics officials met with Indianapolis FBI agents to report the abuse in July of 2015. After several months of no progress on the case, USA Gymnastics met again with FBI agents in Los Angeles in May of 2016. Nassar wasn't arrested until November of that year after Michigan State University police opened an investigation into his misconduct. Nassar still worked at the school at the time of his arrest. He's currently serving a sentence that's equivalent to life in prison. FBI Director Christopher Wray acknowledged the agency's mistakes in a Senate hearing last year.
I'm sorry that so many different people let you down over and over again. And I'm especially sorry that there were people at the FBI who had their own chance to stop this monster back in 2015 and failed. And that is inexcusable.
Both the Parkland and USA Gymnastics cases brought about changes in the way the FBI responds to claims, some of which are already being implemented. They include better documentation for sexual abuse allegations, mandating a 30-day recurrent review process for these claims, and making sure information is properly transferred between field offices. The FBI has also made improvements at the call center where tips can come in, from hiring more call takers and supervisors to stepping up training for staff and creating a management team to review calls about terrorism and threats to kill people. Jane is hoping the tort claims filed in her case have the potential to make a difference.
I think if we can send a really strong message with this case that you can't just let this languish on your desk. You can't avoid it and then one day throw up your hands and say, oh, there's no way we could have known, there's nothing else we could have done. I think that could create a culture where women, children, anyone who's a victim of abuse feels more comfortable coming forward, knowing that that type of behavior isn't going to be acceptable any longer.
So how can the people who are affected by this inaction move forward? To talk about this more, we're bringing in Grace French. She's a former competitive dancer and gymnast and a survivor of Larry Nassar's abuse. She founded a group called Army of Survivors to help other athletes that have been impacted by sexual violence. Grace, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us. We were talking about how the FBI's inaction hurt Nassar survivors earlier in the show. Could you tell us where you think the FBI went wrong in investigating those claims?
Well, thank you so much for having me to begin with. And, there are so many ways that institutions failed us as survivors. Specifically with the FBI, Nassar continued to work with athletes for more than a year while the FBI was supposedly investigating. That led to more than 100 other athletes being sexually abused. These institutions were supposed to protect us, and they failed us.
I think a lot of people who are familiar with your story or the stories of other people who've been in a similar position are curious about your process of healing or coping with what it is that you experienced. If you could give us some insight into what your coping process has looked like.
Nassar has to live out the rest of his life in jail, but we have to live out the rest of our lives with the lasting mental and physical impacts of that abuse. There are good days and there are bad days. I often have those bad days when this comes back up in the news cycle, when we have to continue to fight for accountability. But the thing that keeps me going is focusing on the good that I can create from the pain that I've experienced and the pain that we've experienced. By working to create accountability and justice, we're working to make sure that people in the future don't have to experience what we've experienced. I also am continuing to coach and dance. And I think that brings me a lot of joy because I get to reclaim the sport that I loved so much growing up.
So you're saying you still got it. So it's kind of like, why not try to get other people? I can still move. I can still, do the thing. So let's get other people involved too, right?
Yes, it's an opportunity, to teach lessons in the way that I wish I had been taught and teach those kids in the way that I wish I'd been taught so that they know that they're loved, they're worthy, and that they have a right to their own body.
That's amazing. I am in talking about how you are kind of influencing other people, other survivors. I wanted to talk about Army of Survivors a bit. How has your organization helped other survivors who have been through very similar experiences?
So our organization was built by survivors and for survivors. So in a way, building this organization was part of the healing process for many survivors. Our mission is to bring awareness, accountability, and transparency to sexual violence against athletes. And we do that through creating resources for survivors, building educational programming, and through legislative advocacy, working to create and enshrine legislation that enshrines survivor and athlete rights. So in the past, we have created a Child Athlete Bill of Rights. We've worked to pass both state and federal laws that increase access to justice for survivors and for athletes. And we're also working to create educational programming for coaches so that they can coach in a trauma-informed way and allow athletes who've experienced sexual violence and those who've experienced trauma to continue to do the sport that they love. So we're working to create a culture from the bottom up and making sure that athletes are safe and that they have the joy of sport that they can always look for and look toward.
Grace French, founder of the group Army of Survivors. That group helps other athletes that have been impacted by sexual violence. Grace, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and telling us about how you're helping other people who've been in a similar position. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Christian. It was great to meet you.